Okay, so I want to welcome everybody to World Salon. Thank you to the team at World Salon for uh, setting us up with this very timely discussion. We appreciate it. The topic today, of course, is tariffs and their impacts, how tariffs are reshaping and disrupting the garment industry. We have a fantastic set of panelists to walk through all of these issues. I want to do brief introductions for myself, the panelists today. We're going to try to engage as much of a conversation as possible, and we want to encourage everybody to enter their questions into the Q&A on the side of the screen. And so in just a few moments, I'll introduce myself. We'll turn to each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then I will ask each of the panelists a question to share their views. And over the course of our conversation, hopefully we can answer your questions as well. So with that, my name is Josh Teitelbaum. I am a senior counsel at Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. We are a global law firm, are headquartered in New York. I am based in Washington, D.C. I have been with the firm for almost 9 years. And prior to joining Aiken, I served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Textiles, Consumer Goods, and Materials. I was there for 2 years as a political appointee in the Obama administration. And what that meant was that I was helping to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, in particular its textiles chapter, which would have governed several $1 billion worth of trade in textiles and apparel. Unfortunately, it exists, but the U.S. is not a member of that agreement. So I earned a lot of airline miles out of it and some knowledge that I can share with you all today. Prior to that, I spent 6 years on Capitol Hill advising different members of the House and Senate on trade policy, among other issues. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Sophia first to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sophia Kareem. I wear many hats, but my main role here today is as an activist. So I am the country coordinator for Fashion Revolution South Africa. I will chat a little bit more about who we are and what we do. But in addition to the work that I do with the activist organization, I'm also a lecturer at a fashion school here in Cape Town. Prior to that, I worked in financial services as well as in the kind of impact management space. And I've got a background in politics, philosophy, and economics. And then also back in the kind of academic space now, pursuing a postgraduate diploma in sustainable development. So I'm really just interested in that kind of intersection of fashion, climate, and workers' rights, and seeing how fashion can be a strategic tool, particularly in South Africa, in addressing the kind of triple threat that we have with poverty, inequality, and unemployment, but also kind of focused on that circular economy and the future of, the world that we are faced with at the moment with the poly crises, climate change, etc. How we can also design the fashion industry so that it can still be more mindful of its impact on planet and people. Yeah, that's me in summary.
Thank you so much. Lisa.
Oh.
All right, so I'm Lisa Anderson, president of LMA Consulting Group, and I'm a manufacturing and supply chain expert. So what that means is I work with companies to on their end-to-end supply chain. So from their supplier through their manufacturing processes to their customer's customer, and how to improve the service, profitability, and cash flow from beginning to end. And I've been focused on the tariffs and what companies should be doing and thinking about to stay ahead, to be resilient, and to take advantage of any opportunities along the way.
Thanks so much. Jeremy.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. My name is Jeremy Sporn. I'm a managing director and partner at Boston Consulting Group based in New York. I work as part of our fashion and luxury practice. So I work with fashion, apparel, footwear, brands, and retailers on a range of topics. But over the past several months, have largely been focused on tariff response, which has obviously been a topical issue of the moment and have led BCG's thinking and client work with regards to this topic. So looking forward to being here, and thanks for the discussion.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, Thibaut, your introduction.
Thank you very much, guys. Nice to be here today. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Thibaut Drenel. I'm a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a national security think tank based in Washington, D.C. But I work at the economics program in this national security think tank. So my team does research sort of focusing on the intersection of U.S. trade policy and national security policy, which is where tariff policy comes in, surprisingly enough, although now it's sort of become a fixture of where the United States is. Before that, I've had professional experiences at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the International Trade Administration, all of which have their hands in the sector that I have today. So excited to be part of the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thibaut. And we're actually going to start with you for our question. So given your background at USTR and Commerce, where you and I both worked in ITA, and now your expertise in national security, industrial policy, and supply chains, what might the impact of this new tariff policy be on consumer patterns or brand loyalty in the apparel sector? I'm not sure that folks necessarily make the connection between U.S. industrial policy and tariffs and brand loyalty or consumer patterns, but would love your insight on how these things interact.
Sure. Well, I think, sorry, I'm going to spin the question a little bit, but I think it's a little bit early to tell what's happening in the United States on that front. The main worthwhile domestic point here, which we all know about, given that we're on this panel, the Liberation Day tariffs, when they were first announced, would have been disastrous for businesses and consumers in the apparel sector. Southeast Asia, which is obviously a production hub, and the sector was targeted with particularly high rates. Vietnam had a 46% rate, Cambodia 49%, Bangladesh 37%. All of these countries are enormously important for these supply chains. And I think, we saw the PRC rates coming in. That's been a more bipartisan issue in DC, and diversifying away from the PRC has been sort of a more continual policy goal for the United States. But I think, these rates, these enormous rates on these countries took others by surprise, right? Which is, it's very difficult to have supply chain shuffling policies in a very short amount of time. But now we've reverted back to a 10% rate for these countries, at least right now. We'll see what happens in early July. And some inventory comes from prior to the imposition of the 10% rates anyways. So if we're looking at the development of consumer patterns and brand loyalty, I think maybe the most interesting development here in a wide array of sectors, including in this one, is the rise of economic nationalism in places where there's broad indignation, maybe at the idea that the United States would target them with such rates, right? And the best examples of economic nationalism, I think, are found in Mexico, and even more acutely in Canada, two nations, one of whom is a close trading partner, and the other one is perhaps traditionally our most stable ally, that I felt, I think, especially betrayed by the administration's implementation of tariffs, especially after the USMCA was negotiated in the late 2010s. And Canada being indignant also at the president's 51st state taunts. So we've seen efforts in these nations, but also others, including Europe, to both buy local, so sort of a concerted effort to support homegrown exporters who have lost a competitive edge in the United States, as well as efforts to boycott U.S. goods, right? And this, I think, has been most noticeable in grocery stores, for example, where I've seen grocery stores taken upon themselves to label some goods as Canadian, for example, and then some consumers will grab their U.S. goods, competitive U.S. goods, and actually turn them around on the shelf so that people won't buy them. This is not something that normal, right, in the trade relationship to two nations. I think it's directly related to what's happening between us right now. And so this economic nationalism that comes in the form of boycotts is also going to have an impact on how consumers abroad look at U.S. brands, right? So the tariff world that we're in right now, perhaps the best word to describe it is uncertainty, which can have obviously some profound influences for supply chains. But I think one thing seems to be certain around the world, including when it comes to consumers, there's a little bit of bitterness in the way the United States has handled its economic and sometimes its security relationships. If that trajectory is to continue, I think U.S. brands may face headwinds in foreign markets over long term. This isn't entirely new. U.S. brands already faced headwinds in China, for example, where there was some backlash over brands standing up against forced labor in Xinjiang. But now this sort of reaction against the United States, whether it comes from a good place or a bad place, has sort of gone global, right? And so that's where we're seeing, I think, the most drastic changes.
Super interesting, Thibaut. Have you seen any specific brands called out, specific American brands called out since April 2nd?
Yeah, I mean, there's what the brands that are facing retaliation, right? Like in Europe, for instance, there's bourbon, there's Harley Davidson. Obviously, that's not the sector that's we're talking about, but it is worth mentioning. When it comes to the garment sector, I think Nike and Adidas in particular faced a lot of headwinds with the Xinjiang issue, and that was fairly influential in actually giving a competitive edge to their Chinese counterparts, right? And so we may be seeing sort of other countries seeing the success in the Chinese market of going against the U.S. brands and replicating it into other places. In garment sector, so far, I haven't seen specific U.S. brands being targeted outside of China. I think that's sort of where this policy uncertainty comes in, right? Are we going to see perhaps a more welcoming, policy from the White House, or are we going to keep on seeing, that uncertainty and that sort of inflammatory rhetoric? If it's the latter, then it's likely that we'll see more and more brands really being boycotted by foreigners.
Interesting. So that's very much the consumer-facing aspect of this. Lisa, you manage and advise companies more on their logistics and operations aspect of the tariffs. And so I wanted to see if you could provide us some thoughts on approaches for companies to mitigate the risks associated with these tariff changes, and what is it you're telling companies?
Absolutely. So to your point, it depends. Like overall, clients are definitely reevaluating their supply chain. They have to start by, well, there's two things you should do immediately. Let's hope that you've already started, but you have to have backup sources of supply in place, and you really should gain visibility to your end-to-end supply chain, so you know who you're dependent on, which countries, which suppliers, your suppliers, and so on. Those are two things that are immediate, hopefully already done. Then you'll know at least where you stand, and you should be looking at diversifying your supply chain. So let's say you get all of your production done in China today. Well, that's that's certainly the highest tariff country currently, and you should be diversifying to other places like India, Vietnam, Latin America, etc. So beyond diversifying, then overall for tariffs, not necessarily for apparel, there's a lot of interest in expanding manufacturing capability in the United States to certainly for products that are related to national security, and for in many industries across the board that are interested in taking advantage of some of the opportunities in the industry. In apparel, it's less so because there are more advantages. It's higher labor intensive nature, and it's specialized in Asia right now. There are some in Latin America, but I would say that looking forward, there should be some evaluation on the U.S., but definitely a transition towards a regional supply chain, because there's greater control in the region. So, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, there's lots of countries in Latin America that can be good alternatives. Of course, it's not a no-brainer, because you have to be, there's specialized types of machinery. You typically produce in clusters where you have suppliers located close by one another. And that's why I'm suggesting looking at some regional supply chains, building on capabilities that already exist in Latin America, in addition to countries like Vietnam and India, where it looks like it's likely we'll have good tariff agreements moving forward. And if you keep in mind the diversifying piece of this whole equation, you definitely should have some Latin America capabilities in addition to Asia. The other piece of this, or go ahead.
No, sorry, please.
No problem. The other two things that I would add to this is that the smart companies are proactively looking at advanced technologies, like in this case, like 3D printing for some of the accessories that you can bring into the mix, because it's one of the complications is having a cluster. So the more that you can automate, you also can reduce your labor costs associated with it. So you should really be looking at fitting advanced technologies into the mix as well, obviously, while keeping core to your brand, because that's what's more important than that, because you need to be able to make sure that you're satisfying your consumers. And then the other piece of this equation is pursuing some advanced processes like SIOP, sales, inventory, operations planning, which really means getting a predictive view of your sales forecast, revenue, and staying in front of changing customer conditions, and then evaluating with your supply network and your capabilities, your technologies, etc. How do you best fulfill the needs in a way that's profitable, and will meet your customer value. You'll be able to deliver quickly, and certainly in this industry, you need to be able to change quickly with fashion changes, changing conditions, that type of thing.
So if the older models were first sourcing everything from China, then China plus one. Now, Lisa, it sounds like you are advising companies to be not just China plus one, but in multiple regions of the world.
Correct.
Can the Western Hemisphere truly be competitive with China and Southeast Asia?
Yes, they can, because the labor rates have gone up significantly in China. And there is, really it's a matter of the tricky part is the capital investment. So you'll have to invest something in the machinery and capabilities to bring production up. With that said, that's why I'm also saying there are some, not as specialized as Asia, but there's some countries that have some specialties in some garment and textiles, apparel production in Latin America. So I'm suggesting we stick with building on skills, if you will, or building on strengths and expand that. But from a materials and labor, from the labor standpoint alone, for sure, as we implement advanced technologies and with the labor rates going up significantly as they have in China, for example, the rates in Mexico are already more competitive than they are in China in many cases. So that's going to be true of other Latin American countries as well.
Jeremy, BCG has a whole tariff response team that you're leading for the fashion and luxury sector. Can can you explain, walk us through how you all are advising companies to try to mitigate the impact and maintain their competitiveness?
Sure. And I agree with a lot of what Lisa said in terms of managing the supply chain and diversification of country of origin. We sort of grouped our thinking into three groups. The first is rapid response type elements. So, we're seeing companies and advising companies to set up some sort of a command center to understand the implications of tariffs on their business. A lot of the clients that we serve are large multinational players that have operations all over the world with different types of categories of garments that they're producing. So understanding their exposure and understanding what's possible in terms of moving in a short-term sense is actually a pretty big undertaking in and of itself. The second piece related to rapid response is around sort of narrow short-term moves that can be made to minimize the effect of tariffs. So there are various, legal elements that can be done to understand and to minimize the cost as things come into the US market. The second group of things is around the cost base, and this is some of the stuff that Lisa was describing, is understanding how flexible and responsive your supply chain can be, how you think about manufacturing in one country versus another, how you think about which manufacturing locations are producing product for which end consumer markets. So taking a manufacturing site that was manufacturing product for the US market and ensuring that that product now goes to the European market because the economics support that. These sorts of cost moves, and some of them are short-term and some of them are much more fundamental and require big CapEx and supplier changes. And then the other side is the consumer side, and that's where pricing comes in. And we're seeing a lot of companies think pretty hard about price moves and what this will require. And you've seen in the public domain, Walmart has announced they're raising prices. Lots of the luxury players have already raised prices. And quite a few of our clients are thinking through that and the implications for them. And obviously, raising prices has volume implications and brand implications and competitive implications. So that's a whole set of analyses in and of itself. I don't think consumers are eager to pay more for items that they've grown accustomed to getting for reasonable value. So it'll be a pretty interesting back half of the year as companies have to make those decisions, obviously pending the outcome of the 90-day pause, which I think people feel a lot of uncertainty around how this will play out given the administration's positioning.
Jeremy, I want to dive into this pricing question just a little bit more because, as you noted, it is top of mind given Walmart's announcement and then the president's comments. I guess aside from the political potential fallout,
Sure.
There are a host of calculations that go into whether or not a company is going to either raise prices and be public about it. And I wonder if you could walk through a little bit of that for folks and that dynamic, because it is just paramount.
Yeah, so I mean, the first is understanding the exposure, right? So getting a grip on what will your cost be in this new environment? Are your costs going to go up by 10%, 20% more? And that, of course, depends on your manufacturing base. Luxury players that are manufacturing in Europe are in a very different position than footwear manufacturers that are operating in Vietnam or whatever the case may be. So understanding the exposure, and then I think the question on pricing is a little bit of a game theory between your competitors and yourself, and trying to understand. No one wants to be the first to move, but the idea of absorbing that sort of cost increase is frankly not tenable for most of the apparel and footwear players that are operating on reasonably thin margins. And whether that is public in what environment, I don't know. You saw, I think a few weeks ago, Amazon said they were considering putting a line item that said, tariff cost incremental $8 or whatever, and the administration didn't like that. Walmart made their comment this weekend, and the administration said, "Oh, Walmart should eat that cost." This is the dilemma that a lot of these brands and retailers are working through as they want to keep prices affordable for consumers and want to be there for consumers in a time of uncertainty, but they have to be respectful of their P&L and their investors.
As the lobbyist on the panel, I have no problem noting the dissonance between the president being quite public in saying that perhaps some people will have to pay more for dolls, but when a company notes that some people have to pay more for dolls, that's unacceptable. So there's a little bit of an issue there. When the president says prices are going to go up, it's okay, but when a company says it, that's going to be a problem. So we will come back. Yeah, we will come back to talking about prices, I think, later in this conversation. But Sophia, when you hear advisors to companies talk about supply chains moving very rapidly, that has an impact on workers, of course. And so if orders are coming down in one country and going up somewhere else, workers are not picking up from one country and going to another. Maybe their factory is going down. And so watching all of this chaos in the apparel supply chain, what does that mean for workers?
Yeah, it's quite a turbulent time. And I think in South Africa, we were panicking quite a bit as well when a lot of these, when this, tariff war started to happen. And I think we've been quite fortunate in some ways that we're not a major exporter to the US, particularly as far as the apparel sector is concerned. But we do know that the garment industry is very price sensitive. We have seen in the past how businesses have moved their supply chains based on labor rates and prices alone. And so we're seeing these tariffs potentially affecting the price that retailers will be paying. It is quite concerning in understanding like where these supply chains will be moving, and especially for major countries in like Bangladesh, China, and Southeast Asia that have built their economies around the garment industry. It's really tough for them to kind of face these costs because if supply chains move, it has a severe impact on like their GDP. But also if you think about who these workers are, a lot of the garment workers across the world are women. It's one of the few manufacturing industries that is heavily skewed towards women, and most of these are women of color and located in the global south. And so there's a lot of social justice issues as well when you're thinking about these tariffs and its impact on the garment sector and workers. And in South Africa, I mean, that's the context that I'm most familiar with. We've seen how this has impacted our industry. So prior to, the trade liberalization in the 1990s, South Africa had quite a thriving textile industry that employed, several people within South Africa. And after the liberalization in late 1990s, a lot of retailers moved quite quickly to these Asian countries for their production, and that had a huge negative impact. Several workers lost their jobs. The textile industry has essentially crumbled. We don't have a lot of processing happening anymore, and so there's these huge gaps, and it's really entrenched these kind of specialized industries across the world that are now also dependent on each other. So it's really complex. And South Africa has made concerted efforts, the South African government, but not acting alone. With civil society, activist organizations, and even retailers themselves have come together to really push for localization and increasing local manufacturing and supporting the industry. We have quite high import tariffs within South Africa, so many retailers have to pay a lot of money for their import costs, particularly as it relates to textiles, since we don't have those industries anymore. And so this has an impact on consumers. And so when consumers are making decisions around where to purchase, they often look to these, fast fashion, ultra fast fashion retailers overseas that don't face the same tariffs. And so South Africa had to also look at other tariff structures so that they could be on the same playing field. But even with some of these structures, it's still cheaper for many South Africans to purchase from these retailers as opposed to from the local industries. And so there's still a lot of work to understanding how can we really revive the sector. For us, we do see tariffs as a particular type of instrument that can be used in a way to drive job creation and localized production, but it needs to be done mindfully with that intention. If you're looking at what's happening in the US, it doesn't appear to me that that is necessarily the case. And so for a lot of garment workers in Asia who are dependent on the US market, it is really concerning. And I don't think the kind of structures in the US are designed in the same way as it is in other countries. It seems like it is a lot easier for the president to make these types of decisions, and it has real implications for workers, primarily women in the global south.
Sophia, we are going to come back to you, and I'm going to ask you about how you would use tariffs thoughtfully to support labor. But I want to get to some of the questions that we are starting to get in the chat. And so we have one question, and Lisa, I think in particular, this might be for you, and Jeremy as well. What practical strategies can small to mid-sized garment producers adopt to stay resilient and globally competitive?
Well, they can, certainly they can adopt some of the strategies of, process improvements and utilizing some advanced technologies, because they're not necessarily expensive. I think really the biggest advantage that small manufacturers have is their ability to innovate. It's tricky because they, generally speaking, don't have access to as much capital, which makes moving production or starting up production more challenging. But they certainly can be innovative and more resilient to changing circumstances. And so from that point of view, I would definitely still say that they could look to more of a regional supply chain and diversifying sources of supply, whether, there's not an investment of capital in that. It's more resources and proactively looking at your equation and, looking at some innovative techniques. But I would also suggest that you look at, as Jeremy was saying, you have to really get on top of your changing conditions and your demand, which leads me back to the, like sales and operations planning, which I've seen work effectively no matter the size of the company. It's really getting in totally on top of your demand and your supply, and better managing those processes.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Lisa. I think when companies that I'm working with think about this, they sort of march down the P&L and they say, what can I do to impact the revenue line with pricing or promotions or markdowns more effectively? They look at the cost of goods sold line and say, okay, my cost is going up by X% because of tariffs. How do I manage that in all the ways that Lisa is describing? And then when I think below the gross margin line, what are all the SG&A costs that I have to manage to? And that, depending on the nature of the business, that might be organization, it might be stores and store labor, it might be indirect costs like IT and other services, and what margin do I have to come away with at the end of the day? And managing each of those levers in the P&L is really the only way to manage through it, because the size of the tariffs, at least as initially proposed, was so enormous for most players that they just can't raise price enough in order to offset it, because the consumer will reject the notion to one day pay $10 for an item and the next day pay $16. And I think this is the challenge of the next 6 or 12 months, is for companies to reset the P&L and really look hard at every line item.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And so I think I'm going to use this next question to offer some thoughts as well. So the other question we have in the chat is, with tariffs driving companies to relocate production from countries like China to alternatives such as Vietnam or Bangladesh, what are the long-term implications for global supply chain stability and labor market dynamics in these emerging hubs? And so I will let Sophia talk about the labor market dynamics in these emerging hubs, but I guess I do want to provide my own thoughts on long-term supply chain stability, and perhaps take a quick step back to note that it's going to be very difficult to provide much certainty in either the short, medium, or long term. We are emerging out of a period where the general consensus in the United States was that the free movement of goods, people, data, and ideas would support general prosperity, and we are now moving into an era where the free movement of all of those things has come into question, and the tools that were used in the earlier era to provide long-term stability with respect to trade, like WTO commitments or U.S. free trade agreements, are now being undermined by executive action. And because executive action, by its very nature, can be undone by the subsequent president, there is, in fact, very little long-term stability that the United States, that I see, is going to provide in the next 3.5 years beyond the current administration. And so, 3.5 years, I consider it to be the medium term right now. We don't have much certainty about what's going to happen beyond the next 50 days, roughly. And that doesn't provide much comfort for a lot of companies that are trying to figure out where they ought to source from. I think the one constant theme here, as the question notes, and I think we all recognize, is moving out of China is probably going to be a good long-term bet as far as what the encouragement from U.S. policy is going to be. And we've seen that over the course of the last 8 years, whether it was the Section 301 tariffs in the president's first term, or the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in President Biden's term, or what we expect will be a higher tariff on China under the reciprocal action than on other countries, as well as restrictions in reciprocal trade agreements with non-China countries that encourage them to exclude Chinese inputs. And so there are a host of ways in which the next 50 days and the deals that the U.S. is trying to reach with each of its trading partners that are not China will encourage supply chains to move even further out of China. And so hopefully that is not breaking news to our attendees, that there's going to be increasingly difficult, increasingly high obstacles for garment sourcing with not just from China, but Chinese inputs. So I'm happy to dive more into kind of the politics of all of this, as well as how we expect these reciprocal trade agreements to go and negotiations and questions. But Sophia, I do want to turn to you as well to ask about what this will mean for labor market dynamics in some of these China alternatives.
And I think it's really important that you've brought up like Bangladesh as well. And I think I would just also want to take a step back to speak about Fashion Revolution, and that's kind of the organization that I work with in South Africa, but it's a global movement, and we really started after the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh, where several garment workers lost their lives in a factory collapse. And this is really kind of where we can see that the tension of the fashion industry coming together with trying to keep costs down and having these unsafe working conditions. This factory was not authorized to be built as big as it was, and they saw the structural cracks the day before, so it was also an avoidable tragedy. But due to kind of pressures from retailers and brands, the garment workers were still forced to come into work the next day despite it being unsafe for them. And as a result, over 1,100 garment workers lost their lives and 2,500 were injured. I think it's important that I mention that, and that we don't forget this tragedy. It was in 2013, so it's not that long ago. It's not the first time that people have lost their lives to the fashion industry. It's also not the last time. We have had other, smaller scale incidences with factory fires, all across like East Asia, and even in South Africa, we've also had some, tragedies too. So when we're looking at how these price dynamics and supply chains globally come together to kind of create the fast fashion industry that we have today, it is off the backbone of these garment workers in these countries where they are being exploited. And going forward, Bangladesh, there was the Bangladesh Accord that was developed in 2013 after this disaster, but that's kind of been scrapped now 10 years later. It's really difficult because there is a lot of politics there. And with a lot of these other emerging, economies and hubs around garment manufacturing, it's really important that we learn from some of these incidences so that this doesn't happen again. And that's why organizations like Fashion Revolution and other activist groups are really important in kind of holding the industry accountable and making this information available and pushing for policies and other kind of instruments to protect garment workers and develop a fashion industry that is kind to people and planet. One of the things that we focus on is transparency. And I think it's a really important when we're looking at these tariffs and how it's impacting cost and pricing, making all of these things publicly available, as well as disclosing your supply chains. What does it mean when we say made in China, made in Bangladesh? Even if you look at luxury fashion, when they say made in Europe, that's also something to be interrogated. I think for South Africa and on the African continent, I'm particularly cautious around what could potentially happen in the future when we look at these moving supply chains. Africa has a really large youth population, and the fashion industry could look to the continent for its next manufacturing hub. We also have, AGOA and other kind of instruments, the African Free Trade Continental Agreement. So other things also in play that could potentially feed a new hub on the continent. And I'm just really concerned around how that's going to be developed in a way that still protects workers, because we don't have a lot of these kind of at least in other parts of the continent, the same kind of labor unions and strong labor laws. South Africa does have a really strong labor law and a labor union movement, which has helped protect our garment workers and our industry, but it's not perfect. There's still a lot of gaps. And because of how strong the labor laws are, it's also disincentivized investment into our industry, but also looking to South Africa for manufacturing. So there's a lot of kind of complexities to think about, and I'm really concerned around how things could go. So I really think it's important that we stay mindful of what this could look like so that we can protect against it. Yeah, because fashion is still so labor intensive. It's not going to be one of those industries that's necessarily going to be fully automated. And so as long as people are always going to be involved, we really, really need to keep them front and center when we're making decisions.
If I can jump in real quick for the implications, and definitely want to echo what Sophia said about labor concerns, obviously, but on the issue of implications for emerging hubs here, obviously there's certainly opportunity there for these third countries, but I also think that the imposition of these high rates force diversification away from the PRC faster than may be possible for a lot of companies, right? As well as these other forced labor prevention legislation, both in the United States and in Europe, which certainly try to get to a real problem that should be tackled, but sometimes demand transparency and insights and supply chain that's not possible. All of these may not just encourage the emergence of new hubs, but also encourage circumvention through third countries, right? You disguise goods as primarily made in third country X here, but really it was transshipped and it was made in China. I think we're going to see in the future a significant burden on companies to have deep insights and transparency in their supply chains, which would add significant compliance costs, right? Not just on the forced labor prevention front, but on tariff compliance front. I'm curious to see how businesses can adapt to these kinds of compliance costs, given that their margins can be thin enough as it is with increased prices.
Mm.
And Thibaut, I wanted to ask you about how to properly frame the national security connections with the apparel sector, especially given your background in USTR. In my experience, the top policymakers generally don't connect the apparel supply chain to national security concerns. But given what we've talked about, the impact of shifting supply chains, the apparel supply chain, out of a place like Pakistan, which is engaged, obviously in a conflict with India, or the expiration of the Haiti preference program could lead to greater issues in Haiti. Shifting out of Central America can lead to greater immigration surges at our southern border. The expiration of AGOA at the end of September, could have stability consequences for that region, as well as a 50% potential tariff on Lesotho. There are all kinds of ways in which, quick changes to the apparel supply chain, could affect mass employment in the developing world. And so I wonder if you think that, there's a connection there that is of interest and persuasive to kind of national security officials.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, right? And obviously, starting with a cliche comment, which is what even is national security, right? We had a very, I think, distinct definition of national security in 2015. Now, economics and national security is sort of intertwined, right, in U.S. policy. The issues that you just mentioned, especially mass employment and border security issues related to migration, for example, I think are tied to national security in a more oblique manner. I think what's interesting to think about right now when we're trying to use our crystal ball and understand the policy uncertainty, the uncertainty for businesses related to tariff rates, is what goods are considered national security critical by the administration and by other policymakers, right? In some cases, as you know, you've seen reinstated tariffs based on prior findings by the Department of Commerce, for example, steel and aluminum, 25% tariffs, or the administration is gearing up to implement additional 25% tariffs. It's asked Commerce to undertake new investigations. There's a laundry list of targeted sectors: semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, etc. As far as I can tell, the textiles are not part of this laundry list. And even though the administration in the United States, to be honest, has an increasingly expansive, with an A, increasingly broad understanding of what goods are national security critical, and therefore imports associated with their supply chains require high tariff rates globally, it'd be challenging to find an official that seriously believes this sector is national security critical enough to warrant these kinds of barriers on imports, aside from the 10% blanket rates we already have. I think the bottom line of what I'm saying here, and sort of the takeaway for all businesses, is that what's deemed national security critical has evolved over the past 10 years, right? And it's set to evolve again as we have this increasingly broad understanding of what's national security critical. We shouldn't, stay on the static idea of, okay, it's just critical emerging technologies like semiconductors that are going to face these barriers, right? Or goods that are mostly used for DoD contracts. But it's possible that the defense and the supposedly small garden that Jake Sullivan established is actually going to get larger and larger. We'll see where it goes.
Thanks, Thibault. I hope that textiles and apparel doesn't show up on a Section 232 investigation. And so maybe we'll put this in the category of global security instead of national security. I think we're coming up on the 10-minute mark, and so I want to open it up for any other questions maybe you all have for each other, or other questions from the chat. And so I know we have one in the chat now regarding how tariff policies can be structured to safeguard domestic employment while avoiding consumer cost surges and international retaliation, which seems to maybe be, cover the golden triangle. How can we have our cake and eat it too on apparel tariffs? And so I'm happy to jump in on that, having negotiated some apparel tariffs. I mentioned earlier this earlier model of managed of free trade, and that applied generally for most other goods except for apparel for quite some time. And we had an apparel quota system that was intended to safeguard and protect domestic employment in the textile and apparel industry, and avoid consumer cost surges and international retaliation. And essentially, the United States allotted each country a certain amount of apparel that could be imported. And as a result of WTO negotiations, we ultimately phased out the multi-fiber agreement. And it's worth noting that over that time period, even as we had the textile and apparel quotas in place, domestic employment in textile and apparel manufacturing continued to decrease significantly, dramatically. It accelerated with the accession of China to WTO and permanent normal trading relation status, but that preceded China's WTO accession. And what that tells me is that there's a much bigger story here about technology and automation and globalization rather than necessarily just trade. And so I don't necessarily see a world where we are going back to something like a quota agreement that is intended to protect jobs that frankly are not really here anymore on a scale that would be able to serve the US consumer. But we may be moving to a world where we have a 10% universal baseline tariff on all goods that is additive with very high MFN tariffs on apparel, which generally just make clothes more expensive, but don't necessarily bring the jobs back here. And so, unfortunately, it seems like the worst of all worlds, as opposed to getting to that happy medium that I think you're trying to find.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that in the sense that I don't think it's likely that garment manufacturing would come back to the US. I mean, I think there is some automation, advanced technologies, but it's going to be more, if anything, like Europe, where they might produce some luxury goods. But since Europe already does that, and we're likely to work out agreements with them, it's I don't see significant garment manufacturing moving back to the U.S. But I do see that it should be diversified out of China, and regional supply chains will gain in this case. And I think really when you look at the tariffs at the high level, I think that it's really more of a reallocation of manufacturing, and we can rely more on our regional partners and source more of the national security related items in the U.S. So we'll focus efforts from a regional point of view, and that'll just give an advantage to some of the countries in this region.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any apparel or footwear manufacturer or brand that is seriously considering building capabilities to manufacture in the US. Like I think that's not a reality for a whole bunch of reasons, but I don't think that's a reality. I think that just the environment you described, Lisa, in Europe for luxury has a historical component to it, and it has a margin structure component to it, that those luxury brands operate at a margin structure that they can afford to have a higher cost of goods for a higher quality, that most of the apparel businesses that Americans are buying, basic apparel, sneakers and sweatshirts and bras, and like these are not categories that have the margin structure that can afford that. So I think that working through the interconnected global manufacturing footprint is the long game.
We have one more question in the chat. As tariffs drive up material and sourcing costs, how can apparel brands maintain not just product affordability and margins, but also uphold their commitments to ethical sourcing? So I'm going to put that to the group.
Well, I think, to repeat what Jeremy said before, I think that you have to go line item by line item on your PL. It's not for the faint of heart. And to some degree, like as one of our panelists mentioned earlier, there was the first round of tariffs, then there was the forced labor laws, and the ethical commitments. I mean, there is you have to have additional regulations, and there are costs to that. With that said, though, you should be pursuing advanced technologies, because there is a lot that you can do regardless of where you source your product, where you can be more efficient, automate what you can, predict future, predict your needs so that you can be much more efficient and productive with your end-to-end supply chain. And you can save costs, but generally speaking, overall, though, it is going to add cost to the product, not just the tariffs, but just the situation that we've been talking about here over the last 10 years.
So we've got 4 minutes left technically. I'm happy to offer up a little bit of time if folks want to offer 1 minute of just closing thoughts, takeaways for the group in their area.
Can I actually just add to what has already been said about the ethical sourcing and kind of the dilemmas at play and what do you weigh up? I think I just also, and I think it'll also tie in a little bit to my closing point, but I think I just wanted to mention that when we're looking at the fashion industry or garment manufacturing, I think we can be quite limited in our understanding of what this could look like. And we're often seeing it from the perspective of creating new garments. And I don't think that is the future of fashion. I think we do need to kind of think differently about what the industry could look like. We have a huge issue of waste within this industry. There's already so many garments in circulation at the moment. We could actually stop production altogether and still have enough clothes for the next 100 years. And that's a real, that's a reality thing we need to still keep in mind. Of course, we're not going to do that because of the social justice implications. But I do think that given where we are with the fashion industry and, different countries having different issues, there are, innovative ways that we can still create jobs within the fashion industry that are not necessarily creating brand new products from virgin materials. Just something to kind of mention there. There's also huge opportunities within the secondhand market with regards to tackling textile waste, downcycling, recycling, etc. And I think I would be more excited to see how those will develop in the future. But yeah, just again, from my side, just have been really grateful to be a part of this conversation. I think it's really topical, and it also highlights, the dependence of the fashion industry on these isolated global supply chains and the serious ramifications it could have for economies and for workers when there are these external shifts that that can come out of nowhere in some instances. I mean, we even had COVID and those, how that impacted the fashion industry. And so I think it also highlights how countries can start to develop their own sectors in a way that can still serve their local needs as well as still be internationally competitive, but also looking to the future of the industry and being more innovative and forward thinking so that we're not still kind of stuck in the same way of making fashion, but also creating a cultural shift. We don't need to be consuming as many items of clothing as we are at the moment. And how can we start to really slow down our consumption and have a better relationship with fashion, but also look to create new jobs for people across the world. That's, fashion, as much as it's a really great industry for many people without formal qualifications, it employs many women. I do think it's a great, job opportunity, but I do think it's not the best work either, particularly with how it has been developed. And we can try and find, as a just transition also within fashion, new opportunities for people to still have dignified work and provide for their families.
Thank you so much. We are at time at 6 o'clock. And so I want to thank World Salon for hosting us. I want to thank all of our panelists for offering their thoughts today. It is a fluid and dynamic topic, and I'm sure there would be, we could talk about this for another hour or more if we wanted to. So I look forward to engaging with everyone offline. If you have any questions, please reach out to each of us individually. Thank you so much, and we look forward to the next time.